On the 23rd of June, the United Kingdom will hold a referendum on its membership of the so-called European Union, or Brussels EU. Whatever the outcome of this referendum, there can be no doubt that it will affect the lives of the British people for generations to come. In fact, it's no exaggeration to say that not since the signing of the Magna Carta in 1215 will any political decision have a greater long-term effect on British sovereignty. To understand why, let's take a look at what Magna Carta is. One of the most important historical documents in the history of democracy, the Magna Carta is a charter that was signed at Runnymede by King John of England in the year 1215. A fundamental cornerstone in English constitutional law, it stood for centuries as a legal safeguard against tyranny in England. By recognising rights such as habeas corpus, and by placing even sovereigns and magistrates within the rule of law, Magna Carta went on to lead the world in the development of constitutional law. Unrealised by many British people, however, the so-called European arrest warrant, passed by the Brussels EU in 2002, has essentially repealed habeas corpus in Britain. And the Lisbon Treaty, signed in Europe in 2007, repealed not only Magna Carta's protections against arbitrary and capricious rule, but also the very sovereignty of the British Parliament itself, a body that has been the model for parliamentary systems throughout the world. So the bottom line, if it leaves the Brussels EU, is that the United Kingdom will have the opportunity to restore democracy and the sovereignty of its parliament. But if it votes to stay, the UK's right to self-governance will be only further eroded in the onward march towards a federal European dictatorship. So how did the UK come to join the Brussels EU in the first place? How did it get into this mess? Well, to understand this, we have to go back to 1955 and the formation of something called the Action Committee for the United States of Europe. A secretive committee whose history has essentially been hidden from the British people. The Action Committee for the United States of Europe was founded by a man called Jean Monnet, a French wheeler-dealer bureaucrat. The meetings of this Action Committee began in January 1956 and were held in private. But right from the start, Monnet made it very clear to everyone involved what it was all about. In a letter sent to the people who joined with him in forming the committee, he stated outright that mere cooperation between governments would not suffice. It was indispensable, he said, for countries to delegate their powers to European federal institutions, and that the close association of Great Britain with this must be assured. The committee's ultimate goal, and I quote, was to arrive by concrete achievements at the United States of Europe. Notably, the longest-serving member of the committee's executive committee was a German, Kurt Georg Kiesinger, who sat on it between 1956 and 1965. Kiesinger had been a member of the German Nazi Party and had worked in the Nazi Foreign Ministry's radio propaganda division during World War II. Surprisingly, however, despite knowing both of Kiesinger's involvement and the committee's goals, the leaders of all three main British political parties responded extremely positively when Monnet invited them to take part. British Prime Minister Harold Wilson, for example, on behalf of the governing Labour Party, wrote that the aims of the Action Committee are in close conformity with those to which the Labour Party subscribes. Wilson added that he was pleased to accept the invitation for the Labour Party to join the committee as a full member. He therefore nominated 3 members of his party to serve as its representatives. Anthony Barber, chairman of the Conservative Party in Britain, replied in a similar fashion, saying that after consultation with his colleagues, he had great pleasure in accepting the invitation and that his party would value its membership. Like Prime Minister Wilson, Barbour nominated 3 members of his party to serve as his representatives on the Action Committee. Jeremy Thorpe, leader of the Liberal Party, was equally enthusiastic, saying that he would join the Action Committee with high hopes. He added that the sphere of cooperation must be enlarged to include diplomacy and defence and large parts of social and cultural policy. So the attendees at the Action Committee's 14th session, which took place on the 11th of March 1969, included members from all 3 major British political parties, all of whom, I should stress, sat not as private individuals but as nominated representatives of their parties. The meeting was held in London and was a key moment in luring Britain into the arms of the Brussels EU. Meetings of the Action Committee for the United States of Europe were held throughout the 1960s and only concluded after 1973, when Britain had joined the European Economic Community, the forerunner organisation to the Brussels EU of today. But of course, it isn't only the British people who've been misled about the Brussels EU. The whole of Europe has been, and still is being, deceived about what the Brussels EU is and what it does. You see, the Brussels EU isn't a democracy. It's a dictatorship. The people of Europe have neither control over the executive level of the Brussels EU, nor even over the legislative process. Even the Brussels EU Parliament has no means of effectively controlling these things either, because unlike in a democratic parliament, the Brussels EU version has no right for independent lawmaking. To all intents and purposes, under the Brussels EU system, the power of the people to determine their government has been transferred to corporate interests. I guess at this point you might be wondering who designed the blueprint for the Brussels EU. I mean, who was it who wanted it to be like this? To understand this, you have to go back to 1941, 2 years after the outbreak of World War II. In Dresden, Germany, at that time, there was a little-known Nazi research institute, which essentially drew up the blueprint for what we now know as the Brussels EU. The head of this institute was a man called Arno Zolter. In 1941, Zolter summarised the Nazi plans for post-World War II Europe in a book titled The Greater Sphere Cartel, an instrument of industrial market order in a new Europe. Astonishingly, Zolter's book describes all the key elements that we see around us in the Brussels EU of today. It describes what we now know as the European Commission, for example, the unelected executive body of Europe. It outlines the system of Brussels EU directives, the system via which laws are made in Europe today and handed down to the Brussels EU member countries to implement into their national laws. And it talks about implementing a master agreement to govern the details of any ongoing changes in European law. This master agreement eventually took shape and form in something we now know as the Lisbon Treaty, which became law in Europe in 2009. You can learn more about all of this in our book, The Nazi Roots of the Brussels EU. First published 6 years ago, the book is now available in 12 languages. With the facts about the Brussels EU becoming ever more widely known with each passing day, regardless of the outcome of the UK referendum on the 23rd of June, it's clear there can now be no escape for the Brussels EU. One way or another, change will come. and dictatorship will be replaced by a Europe for the people, by the people. A Europe where democracy and people come first. If the British people make the right decision on the 23rd of June, the first step towards creating this new kind of Europe will have been taken. But regardless of whatever happens in the British referendum, the people of Europe have suffered enough at the hands of the Brussels EU. The time for change has come.